Unwanted, Chapter 18, Part 2. That summer of 1978 marked 3 years under the communist rule. Even though the new government had successfully taken over the south of Vietnam, many of its citizens still hoped for the Americans' return, and they listened in secret to the forbidden BBC News report every Monday night. As life grew increasingly harder, hope became the only luxury that the communists had not yet snatched away. Sadly for many, hope became a destructive force that led their lives in a prolonged limbo of futile expectancy. Instead of relishing life, people merely existed. Such was the case with my family. My mother had accomplished nothing in 3 years except for waiting. She had waited for the communist collapse from either inflation or the government's weakness. She had waited for a possible revolution or war to overturn the new regime, since tensions between the people and the officials was always strong. But the waiting had dragged on for too long. The fire in all of us had been extinguished. Shame was no longer the primary issue in my mother's mind. Piece by piece, the stash of jewelry in my pocket had been sold for the family's survival. Finally, she was flat broke and at a dead end. Tired of waiting in vain, my mother rented space in the city's largest market, 5 kilometers from my home. Her shop was a small compartment of 100 square feet, wedged between a sticky rice vendor and a sandwich store. The market, composed of hundreds of small businesses like my mother's, was divided into sections that specialized in seafood, livestock, vegetables, fabric, electrical appliances, pharmacy items, and at the farthest border, farm produce. Beyond this was the city dump, supermarket of the homeless. My mother sold mainly rice, plus a few other agricultural products, such as potatoes and beans. The communists, however, took a dim view of a business like my mother's, believing they drove up prices and disrupted the economy. In a sweeping proclamation, the government prohibited the middle class from carrying out their trading activities and sent troops to confiscate their supplies. They promised to help my mother find new employment if she gave up her business. But despite the agreement, her applications for employment were repeatedly denied. My mother's shop was forced to close after being open for only a few months. In the last minutes before the raid, she managed to distribute some of her goods among her friends. More sophisticated searchers by the government soon followed, thorough and without warning. At the market, most businessmen were less fortunate than my mother. The authorities, through the legions of youth volunteer squads, raided many shops at night, seizing their inventories. The next day, they required the owners to show a bill of sale to prove their right to the impounded goods. Since most of the supplies had been traded through black market channels, the owners had no receipts. Forfeiting their stocks, the merchants were wiped out. The day the youth squad closed my mother's shop, their anger and frustration at finding nothing of value left a trail of destruction behind. One of the squad members, a 14-year-old girl in a blue uniform, spat in my mother's face. "Don't you dare reopen this counter-revolutionary shop. We'll come back and make sure that you don't." Long after they had gone, my mother remained sitting on the floor with her head bowed, calm yet unmoving. From outside, a figure ventured into her shop, stopping at the threshold to stare at her. All that my mother could see was the guest's dirty feet, clad in cheap sandals. She looked up to see the familiar face of Mrs. Duong, who was staring back at her. 3 years under the yoke of communism had turned her boisterous friend into a repressed, aged woman. However, Mrs. Duong's laughter was still contagious, ringing like crystal the moment she recognized my mother's face. "God and Buddha!" she exclaimed. "Is that you, Kuhan? Oh, heaven, what has happened to you, darling?" My mother gazed vacantly into space past Mrs. Duong's face. Bursting with excitement from the unexpected reunion, Mrs. Duong fell to the floor among the broken pottery containers and pressed her face against my mother's neck. My mother, however, did not return the embrace. Her mind was somewhere beyond the pungent stench of the market, shocked from the loss of her property. For several days, my mother stayed in bed, refusing to eat with the family. She talked to Jimmy and me about abandoning us to go live somewhere else. Sometimes, despite her elaborate plans to escape life's troubles, she focused on the mass suicide of our family, excluding my grandparents. Frightened by her depression, Jimmy and I avoided her bedroom as if it were a leper's colony. Fortunately, with the help of Mrs. Duong, who became a frequent visitor, my mother decided to pick up the pieces of her life and plunge back into the trading markets. Although she understood business from her experience at the bank, the idea of competing with other traders to purchase a line of goods and then sell them at a higher price was unpleasant to her. Still, she knew she had to find some way to put food on the table. That same summer, Luan returned from the Young Volunteers. After 3 years of running through the jungles in a unit of over 200 young women, proving her dedication to the government, her service time was up. The day the dean dismissed me from the parade, on the way home, I spotted Luan on the street among her comrades. Even though she wore the standard oversized blue uniform made of thick khaki that concealed any remotely feminine curves, I saw her lovely face at once. Years of hard work under the direct sun had turned her skin brown. A large military backpack containing all of her possessions weighed like a rock on her slim body. She smiled when she saw me running toward her, screaming her name. We held each other tearfully in a long embrace before we could break apart to examine one another, laughing at the changes we saw. "Why didn't you write to me? Didn't you get any of my letters?" she asked me. "No," I replied. "We've never gotten any, and we couldn't write to you because we didn't know where you were. How many letters did you send us?" "I don't know." She looked confused. "A lot. At first, it was almost one letter a week. I even asked for personal delivery from a friend. It's strange that you didn't receive any." She mused for a moment. "I can't believe that they all got lost. It's too bad, but you know how it is, living in such conditions. But it doesn't matter now because most importantly, we are together at last, right? Let's go home." We were stopped at the door by Jimmy's dog, wagging its tail happily and licking our faces with its rough tongue. No longer a puppy, it had grown to almost the size of a well-developed German shepherd, and its weight almost knocked Luan over. It barked, and Luan hid behind me to watch it in disbelief. "That can't be Lulu, can it?" she asked, then answered the question herself. "Of course it isn't. This dog doesn't have a crippled paw." "Lulu is gone," I said, scratching my brother's mutt behind its ears. "This is a boy, and his name is Lou."